a renowned expert in colonial and post-colonial studies. I will just briefly explain Dr. Gill-Khan's insightful research, particularly highlighted in her work, The Politics of Integration, provides a unique historical lens into ethnic minority integration in both Britain, in the UK, and Europe. And her passion for literature and global history is evident in her engaging lecture. When I read your bio in your website, I was really amazed. I would say notably your academic journey, including, what you wrote on your thesis, and subsequently it became a book, The Politics of Integration, Law, Race, and Literature in Post-War in Britain and France. I'm gonna really, I'm patient to read this book. It's really interesting to compare these two powerful nations in terms of law, race, and literature, especially in the post-war. And I would like to start my first question, like after the post-Ottoman transformation. Can you elaborate on the key transformation that occurred in the region, the post-Ottoman rule, and how they set the stage for the subsequent events, about factors leading to the Balfour Declaration?
Yes, well, thank you very much for your warm introduction. I would like to begin just by reading out the Balfour Declaration, just to set the scene for our discussion. His Majesty's government view with favour the establishment in Palestine of a national home for the Jewish people, and will use their best endeavours to facilitate the achievement of this object, it being clearly understood that nothing shall be done which may prejudice the civil and religious rights of existing non-Jewish communities in Palestine, or the rights and political status enjoyed by Jews in any other country. Now, believe it or not, this is a single sentence of just 67 words that many have argued is the genesis of what we are witnessing today in Israel and Palestine. And as we will discuss later, I think it's actually just one facet of the story. It's a very important one, but there was something else happening on the ground alongside the declaration. It didn't change things overnight. So what was the Ottoman and then the post-Ottoman region looking like at that time? So when the declaration was announced, Britain and France and the Allies were hoping that there would be an Allied victory. And so to begin with, there were three plans about what to do with post-Ottoman Palestine. And sorry, I'm just going to consult my notes so that I have the right information. So there were three scenarios, and one of them was an agreement between Britain and France called the Sykes-Picot Agreement, very famous, and it was a secret treaty ratified in 1916, and they drew the famous line in the sand to divide the Ottoman territories between them. And within these spheres of influence, the French and the British, there were to be special zones for direct administration or control. So Palestine was referred to as the Brown area and would be one of these special zones. The exceptions were that the British would be accorded Haifa and Akka. These were strategic decisions. For example, Haifa was seen as an important port to rival French control of the Alexandretta coast. So you can see how imperial rivalries were shaping the carving of Palestine. Now, this Sykes-Picot Agreement contradicted what the French and the British would go on to promise to these territories, which would come under, well, the League of Mandates, but first British and French rule. But the British and the French promised in the Anglo-French Declaration to the Palestinians in 1918 that they would be guided to an independent state. And Britain had already actually made another promise to the Sharif of Makkah, known as the McMahon Correspondence of 1915. So we have the Sykes-Picot Agreement between Britain and France to divide the soon-to-be territories that would go to the Allies. And you have this promise to the Sharif of Makkah. Now, this correspondence, the McMahon correspondence, is very controversial. And as I found, actually, most things on this topic are controversial because they're contested and they haven't been settled. Now, this letter was in a series of many between Sir Henry McMahon, who was the British High Commissioner in Egypt, and Hussein bin Ali, who was the Sharif of Makkah. And in the letter, McMahon gave the assurance that Britain would recognize an independent Arab kingdom in return for the Hashemites leading an Arab revolt against Ottoman rule. Now, Hussein had asked for Greater Syria, which was Syria and Palestine. So you can already see how the British and the French were viewing the territories as geopolitical locations, not only in terms of their interests, but what they would later on promise and renegade on. It wasn't seen as part of Greater Syria as it was by the Sharif of Makkah and the Palestinians themselves. So he asked for this Greater Syria, Mesopotamia, modern-day Iraq, and the Arabian Peninsula. But McMahon stipulated exceptions which did not include Palestine. So it was assumed that Palestine would fall under Hussein's rule. But this continues to cause controversy in terms of what the British meant, and in any case, they didn't keep this promise. So Palestine was subject to four main promises: a special zone, apart from which would be administered, it was to be under, I think, direct administrative or direct control. But apart from Haifa and Akka, which would go to the British as a geopolitical location, it was promised to the Sharif to be part of the Hashemite kingdom, to the Palestinians in the Anglo French declaration that they would be guided towards self-governance, and then to the Zionists, a national home for Jews. So we have four different ways that Palestine was viewed and different promises that were made to different stakeholders.
So, I mean, when we see the Sykes-Picot Agreement, and we see that these territories after the Post-Ottoman area, which they lost the war against the France and British. So this imperial power, they have been shaped and shared. The land has been after the rule of Ottoman Empire. And what I learned from you, so they promised to Sharif Hussein to kind of dividing today Syria, Mesopotamia, today Iraq, and Saudi and Jordan. Why they didn't include Palestine? My first question. And second, how these, like say, the leader, the sheikhs of the Arabs, when they revolt against the Ottoman, how they didn't push British and France to include Palestine in their territory?
So so the British promised the Sharif of Makkah Greater Syria, apart from Haifa and Akka, in return for their revolt against Ottoman rule. So this was in the McMahon correspondence. Now, when it was discovered that the British renegaded, there were protests, there were revolts. It's caused, and I think it continues to cause, a lot of bitterness, because it was a succession of letting down their word. But I think at the time it never sort of gained a momentum that the British would reconsider their eventual decision to to the Zionists to create a national Jewish home in Palestine.
You report that when the Balfour Declaration has been made, it was to 1917, if I'm not wrong.
Yes.
So do we know any record how the reaction of those Arabs, the reaction to the Balfour Declaration, do they think it will be really a promised land to Zionists later, or they just didn't care? Do we have any record?
Well, they were incensed, and not only the Arab Palestinians, but people in government, other senior political figures, troops on the ground, because after the British took control of Palestine as a mandate, that first it came under military rule under General Allenby, and then it was transferred to civilian rule, and then eventually it was handed over to the Zionists. So while all of this was going on, there was feedback from many different, how shall I say, people on the ground and people in government who viewed it as catastrophic and completely out of sync with the reality of Palestine, which was 90% Arab. And the declaration didn't change things overnight. Jewish immigration had been going on since the late 1800s. Also, there were pockets that were becoming quite violent as well. But what happens after the declaration, I think these sort of protests step up. So in 1921, there was the unrest in Jaffa, and I think this was decisive in sort of beginning the internal partitioning of Palestine, as Thompson calls it. Sorry. And I would just give you some facts here that so it was announced in an Arabic newspaper. And after these riots in Jaffa in 1921, Arab and Jewish communities started to grow apart, and segregation started to take root, and separate Jewish and Arab areas began to develop. So the Jews fled and settled in Tel Aviv, which became a center of Jewish activity, and Herbert Samuel, who was a senior figure in the government, granted it a separate municipality. And as Thompson eloquently puts it in his book, The Legacy of Empire, it reflected the internal partitioning of Palestine. Then we have the Arab Revolt in 1936, which is brutally crushed by the British and the Haganah, a military wing of the Zionist settlers. This led to the Peel Commission, the findings of which were that the declaration was untenable, the British had failed, and Palestine should be partitioned. And then we had a few other quite momentous events. And the British did actually try to exercise some damage control, so try to make concessions to the Arabs and say, well, if you accept this declaration, the settlers may bring some benefit to everyone, but that Palestinian Arabs rejected everything because they could not accept that a decision had been made on their behalf and their land given to another group of people that by then, by the declaration, they were already being seen as hostile, and there were differences that were growing. So I think the declaration actually tipped off unrest that had already been happening since the early 1900s.
Or any research about why the British has made this declaration? What is the reason? There is some, the murmurs going around some articles that time the Zionist was controlling media and also the banking system, and the British were trying to benefit from them, and then they decided to make Balfour Declaration. Do this kind of news is true or is just fake news? What was the the real reason behind British government to make this declaration?
Yes, well, I haven't found this in, I haven't found evidence of this, that there was some kind of conspiracy or the Balfour Declaration really wasn't inevitable. Before David Lloyd George came to power in 1916, this was decisive. So before he became Prime Minister, the one previous to him, Asquith, wasn't interested at all in this idea. Other key senior political figures rejected it outright. There was also well, actually, I want to mention Edwin Montagu later. He was a member of the cabinet, and he was of a Jewish heritage, and he was the only one who opposed the declaration the day that it was signed off. And there were reports that he was close to tears because he thought that the declaration was anti-Semitic, as I hope we'll have the chance to discuss later, but no one listened to him. I think it was more the case of a convergence of different factors that aligned at the right time. So the founder really of political Zionism, although he wasn't a founder, these ideas were circulating at the time, but he really consolidated the roots of political Zionism that would be carried on by subsequent Zionists, Theodor Herzl. Now, he lobbied the government. So Asquith, he went to see the Sultan in Constantinople, I think the King of Italy, the Tsar of Russia, the German Emperor, even the Pope, to try and get support for this Jewish state. He was rejected. No one was interested. But things changed when David Lloyd George, who it has been argued was a Christian Zionist, so he had a very romantic view of Palestine. He'd never been to Palestine. Even Churchill had been to Palestine. And it's interesting that Churchill had also quite similar romantic ideas about Palestine. But when he went there and saw what was happening on the ground, he wobbled a bit. So you can see that, it was never a sort of a consistent agenda. It was different factors coming together. And David Lloyd George's Christian Zionism, together with his colonial racism towards the Arabs, and Arthur Balfour's very similar views, very anti-Semitic as well. I mean, the declaration actually is anti-Semitic, as Edwin Montagu argued, because it would solve the problem of Jewish immigration into Britain. Not no one, but Britain didn't want Jewish immigrants because they knew that the population wouldn't tolerate them. And so by granting Palestine to the Zionists, it solved their problem. And by this time, I think they didn't want to publicly look bad. Things were beginning to change. By the time the League of Mandates came into being in the early 1920s, the imperial powers, so Britain and France, were encouraged to let go of their empires by guiding their subjects to eventual independence and self-governance and national determination. And even though there was still lingering racism because some countries were seen as capable of ruling themselves, whereas others needed some help. Nevertheless, I think it was a step in the right direction. So no, I wouldn't say that there was a kind of conspiracy or control. I think it was just the way that factors came together. We have Christian Zionism of key political figures. We also have the exploitation of unfounded fears. So I think it was Chaim Weizmann, who was another senior Zionist. So Herzl died in the early 1900s, and Chaim Weizmann really took off where Herzl went off. And I think he was actually even more ferocious than Herzl. He was ferocious in his lobbying. He was absolutely relentless. He was very charismatic. He had excellent connections in the British government with key figures. He'd also contributed in the war as well. I think he had offered for free some development in chemicals that helped the British war effort. And so with these sorts of connections, he also exploited politics during the First World War to say that, well, if you give support to the Zionist claims, it will strengthen, you know, your position and lead the Allies to a victory.
Know any the reaction of the France at that time, because in the beginning there was Psycho and Monsieur Picot, and they decided to divide this region. And when France aware about Balfour Declaration, there was some reaction of French Imperial minister or any reaction so far at that time?
I actually don't know too much about the British reaction, because I focus mostly on the British, and the British don't seem to have mentioned the French reaction, which is very interesting. But I would imagine that they would have been very surprised. I mean, there were 4 different promises that were made.
One of the article I read it, and it shows that in fact some Zionists has been talked with the French. They were not interested, and kind of the Zionists were not trying to involve France in this Balfour Declaration, and they returned to UK and they make just what British, what I read it. And my question now, could you explain, you know, we have some terms, we have to make it clear. So we have colonialism, we have Zionism, and of course we have anti-Semitism, which has been raised in Europe, especially during the World War II. And how this definition evolved over time?
Of anti-Semitism and Zionism.
Yeah, and
yes, this is a very interesting question. I think we have to really understand what was meant by political Zionism at the time, because even when I think about Zionism now, to me, it has, I wouldn't say a different character, but it's acquired more sort of multiple layers and meanings. And I think it's become divorced from the origins, really, of what it meant at the time.
Sorry to interrupt you. Everything started with Theodor Herz, or it was also before?
Yes, so there were Zionist ideas circulating at the time. In fact, the term Zionism was coined not by Herzl, although he was the first person to popularize the term Zionism. It was actually coined by Nathan Birnbaum, who was also a Viennese Jewish thinker who ironically ended up rejecting political Zionism, co-founded an anti-Zionist newspaper in the Netherlands after fleeing the Nazis. And I think he lost quite a few of his family members as well. And he ended up practicing Orthodox Judaism. So what Herzl did was to sort of build upon these existing ideas, but to really consolidate it. And in 1896, he published a small booklet called Der Judenstaat, the Jewish state. And I think this is the first time that anyone had sort of heard of the idea of this Jewish state. And how long the working day would be, you know, it would be a 7-hour working day in this colony. It really is like a manual for beginning a new state. And he argued that the only way for Jews to escape anti-Semitism was to live free and to live free lives was to establish this state in either Palestine or Argentina through colonization. So Palestine had been quite a popular idea prior to Herzl, but I don't really think he was committed to it. I think he was of the feeling that, well, anywhere, you know, it would be great if it was Palestine because of the ancient connection. But really his concern was establishing a nation state and a modern and secular state. So even though he used terms like the Promised Land and so on, I don't think he was attached to it. It seems like he presented it as a modern solution to an ancient problem, and also an ancient land to a modern problem. And this was against the backdrop also of the Jewish question and anti-Semitism. So there were pogroms in Imperial Russia and Eastern Europe at the time. And I really recommend a film called Fiddler on the Roof, which gives you a sense of the lives of Jews in Imperial Russia. But there were many responses to what was happening to Jews in Russia and Eastern Europe. And he didn't actually generate widespread support from other Jews, especially in Central and Western Europe, who had a far better standard of life. And for those who wanted to emigrate, America was their first choice, and it continued to be. So I think it's important to keep in mind that it wasn't an idea that took root amongst, the majority of the Jewish population. It was an idea, and it became a very extreme idea that didn't appeal to Jews at the time. And there was a lot of opposition to it from figures like Ahad Ha'am, Yitzhak Epstein, and Nathan Birnbaum. And these thinkers are absolutely fascinating when you put them in context of what Herzl was suggesting and what Chaim Weizmann would go on to continue. There was very strong opposition, and it converged on questioning Herzl that where are the Arabs? In this new nation state, you don't even mention the indigenous Arabs.
Well, it seems the same things continue as we have a lot of Jewish opposition. What is going now in Israel-Palestine conflict? It seems that Zionism has been created, not agreed by all Jewish. It's a lot of Jews still they are opposite the idea, and it was great to know these details. Could you also, regarding the historical context, how would you define the solution, the potential solution in terms of historical perspective? And could you also explain those immigrants in historical perspective? They started to come from where? Do we have some figure? And how it started? Do they, let's make the idea of Zionism, and then British promised them, and they start to immigrate to Palestine. In the historical records, how it evolved, how it changed, how many people arrived from where? Could you explain a little bit about this? And how was the reaction of the early Arabs in Palestine when they come to the land?
Yes, so immigration started towards the end of the 1800s, mostly from Eastern Europe, by quite extreme Zionist communities, and they established these pockets in Palestine. And I think at the beginning there was a sort of unease because the Jewish immigrants from Eastern Europe and Russia were very different from the Arab Palestinian culture. And I think it was tolerated to a certain point, given what was happening in Europe with anti-Semitism. And they were, I think, small enough to not cause that much disturbance. But well before the Balfour Declaration, I would say early 1900s, it began to become clear that no, there was an agenda. There was a sort of, you could see that there was an idea for a Jewish state that was taking root well before the declaration was announced. And I think in 1911, there was the establishment of a newspaper by an Arab Christian called, I think, Najib Nasser, called Palestine. And in it, he warned that the Arab Palestinians have to really become aware of what's going on, because they could become exiles in their own homeland. So you could see that the Arab Palestinians were beginning to think that, okay, this isn't just some kind of benign, migration to escape. And some of it was, there were some peaceful pockets of settlements, but it became very clear also when the settlers started to arm themselves to defend their land, that, this spells disaster for the Arab Palestinians.
And I think, the awful news, what we have seen today, this last 2 months, and I hope it will cease fire soon. And in historical perspective, exploring potential solution, what your thoughts on the historical perspective, what was the problem apart to creating this Israel-Palestine conflict? What from Balfour Declaration, what was the main mistake? It's not to make the people from different religion and different background to not creating living together peacefully.
Okay, I think the problems were many, but the main problem was absolute dismissal of indigenous Palestinians at the hands of the policymakers at the time. So David Lloyd George and Arthur Balfour and some other political figures. And I think that is evidence enough of a colonial mindset towards the people that really paved the way for something like this to be persistently defended. Because when troops in Mandate Palestine, senior figures like Lord Curzon was the Viceroy of India, he was a very prominent figure, he expressed his unrest at what the British were doing. So I think there was evidence enough for the government to change their mind. And I think they started to change their mind too late. And what I also think is the main problem of the declaration that we didn't have that much chance to go into is that the words seem very benign. They're actually very, very sort of, you read it and you think, oh, okay, what does that, even mean? But
it's a one-page letter.
It's just one sentence of 67 words, and it says so much, and yet it says nothing at all. What does it mean to facilitate? What does a home mean? It's very dry language, but I think what it masks is the development of political Zionism that, as we discussed, started off with a very sort of colonial mission and an agenda couched. There was always a very detailed plan about how this colony, Herzl stated, there would be colonization and how this colony would be established. But by the time we get to the declaration, even though colonialism was the norm, it wasn't extraordinary what Herzl and subsequent Zionists were asking for. It was actually of its time. We look at settler colonialism in Australia, for example. These were accepted ways of living. But by the time we have the League of Nations in the early 1920s, there was a real move away from all of that. That it was the beginning, I think, of needing to dismantle the empire because of what happened in the First World War. And Woodrow Wilson, the American president, played a huge part in this transition. And so it seems to me that the Balfour Declaration was made based on these old ideas of colonization, which in fact looked like a very violent settler colonialism. It wasn't like a pioneer, well, the language of a pioneer colony as well belies the fact that people would be removed from the land that they want to settle on. So by the time that the declaration is announced, those ideas really don't have any currency anymore. So when they're implemented, so when Jewish immigrants settle the land and it becomes, a violent settler colony, you almost think that, did the British intend for that to happen? And it has been argued that the face of political Zionism that was presented to, say, David Lloyd George kind of played up to his romantic idealism of Palestine, as this ancient land in redemption, and the wandering Jews, going back to their ancient homeland. I think it's difficult and this is the thing with reading historical documents. It's really difficult to work out exactly what motivated the people who made those decisions. But my feeling is that the Balfour Declaration is like a hodgepodge of all of these different ideas that really were on their way out. And even a nation state, the horrors of the Second World War were seen as resulting from the excesses of nationalism and an exclusive ethno-religious identity, ethnic purity, and so on. The fact that Herzl and subsequent Zionists would push for a nation state, I mean, that should have really alarmed key figures as well, that, hold on, we've just emerged from the embers of this, and the Zionists are asking for a purely Jewish state. What could this mean? And I think all of this is left out, from this single sentence. And we almost have to trace the evolution of the political Zionism and ideology and what was happening on the ground to kind of reconstruct that actually it was completely invalid. It shouldn't have been made at that time. And if I have a few more minutes, you asked about a possible solution. I think what I'm witnessing on the media is, and just very generally, is a very black and white narrative of colonialism and resistance, and it often happens when conditions are imposed that we galvanize, we think of conflict in this way. But the reality is that Palestinian communities have developed very differently in Israel, in the occupied territories, and in Gaza. And I think any solution would have to really listen to Palestinians in those different areas with very different lives and very different concerns about what they want. So in Israel, it might be the dismantling of, well, not might be, it must be the dismantling of apartheid and segregation. In the West Bank, it would be the end of the occupation. In Gaza, we need a ceasefire first before we can talk about anything else. But I think we need to maybe rethink the way that we're imposing a narrative onto what's happening and actually listen to the Palestinians. And in my research on this area, the saddest thing is that no one listened to the Palestinians. It was like a pawn between these great powers. Afterwards, it would be between Jordan and Egypt and other Arab interests and the Cold War and so on. But the Palestinians, live in these territories, and they must be asked what they want and what they need. So I would just suggest that, as always, speak to the people and do what the Balfour Declaration didn't do, and reinsert back, the people that you're making decisions about.
Well, thank you. It was really great. And you remind me the American President Jimmy Carter book, the whole "We Can Make Peace in Holy Land." It's a great book. I have just finished, and it's same as you said. He always pursue to have two-state solution with Palestine people, to listen them, to settle down. And what he was really doing in Camp David, gorgeous. But unfortunately, the Sadat Anwar has been assassinated.
Yes.
The hostage in Iran has made him to focus on other things. So each time the problem, the conflict in this Holy Land Israel-Palestinian. We have to think definitive solution because it has been almost a century, and today I really appreciated what you explained from the historical perspective. And as we cannot change history,
Yes.
we can do something for the future. And I think the academician has a potential role for this transformation. I really appreciated what you have telling us about your great thoughts. Would you like to add something else?
Yes, well, thank you very much. I've learned so much from our discussion, and I want to say that I spent a large part of my life studying colonialism and post-colonialism at a time when it was a new subject, believe it or not. 20 years ago when I was at university, post-colonialism was, the new exciting topic, Edward Said, Orientalism, and so on. And it's really developed, it's grown, it's become, something far beyond, what I remember it. And yet, with all of that knowledge, with all of that information, you just feel absolutely helpless when it comes to what's happening in Israel and Palestine. And my prayer and my hope for so many years has been that something now has to change. And actually this is a call, for the whole world and for people who have the power to choose truth, justice, and peace before great gains, before politics, before self-interest. And I think it's almost as if, this is what's happening in Gaza is putting humanity to the test. That what will we choose? Humanity or selfish agendas that actually don't end up benefiting anyone? And that Gaza isn't a place over there. We're united in our humanity. So I would say that, this really is a question that is posed to every single human being who is interested in what's happening in Palestine and Israel, that, enough. There is no place for this in our world anymore. There might have been 100 years ago, 200 years ago. The history of humans is abysmal, but also there have been absolutely incredible things that have happened in history, not because that's how history rolls, but people make decisions. And like people made the Balfour Declaration, and they didn't need to, there was opposition, it could have gone the other way, but they did. People can make other decisions and to do the right thing in the service of justice.
I totally agree with you. Thank you for your fruitful thoughts. And I would like to have another session to talk about Edward Said and about colonialism or Orientalism.
Yes, that would be wonderful.
I think it will be wonderful because the way your research area and the way you understand from him, it will be great to listen you.
I look forward to that. It's been a long time since I've spoken about Said, but I would really love to.
I think it's time to talk about him.
Yes, yes, I do.
Thank you so much for accepting our invitation, and hope to see you again. And if you come to Paris, please let us know. We can have meeting face to face.
I would really love that. Thank you again, and thank you for inviting me.
Thank you. Have a good day.
You too. Thanks. Bye.